Human brains are amazing. But one thing that evolution never prepared us for was the comprehension of extremely large numbers and scales. When you need to prepare for surviving season to season, you only need count 100 or so days at once. If you imagine those in your tribe, you can easily visualize 150 or so people, max. But when it comes to large numbers and probabilities, we lack an efficient understanding of scale. It's extremely hard to comprehend, say, the size of the universe, or perhaps even worse than spatial dimensions are temporal ones, billions and billions of years or whatnot. And that's sort of what today's video is about. A mental exercise, a thought experiment, as to how humans could stretch their influence over one of those great distances. 10,000 years or more, to be exact. The term nuclear semiotics refers to a young discipline of research that focuses on creating warnings indicating nuclear waste repositories which will survive into the distant future, a future of at least 10,000 years. What's so fascinating about this research is how it exposes just how fragile so many of our human structures can be. Cultures and languages, for example, can be created and go extinct in just a fraction of that time. So how do we communicate something so dangerous as nuclear waste and radiation, as well as the poisoning effects it can have on a human body, to a civilization which shares nothing in common with us? It's led to some brilliant minds coming up with fascinating ideas, worst-case scenarios, and ingenious solutions to the problem. And we'll be exploring the nooks and crannies of that today. If you enjoy this video, make sure to subscribe to my growing channel. We've just celebrated our 3rd birthday, and I'm committed to reaching 100,000 subscribers before our 4th. Thanks again for choosing to spend your time here, and let's go ahead and get into this iceberg with our first tier. Nuclear semiotics. Nuclear semiotics is a field of research which seeks to propose the most effective ways to warn future generations of the dangers of nuclear material, even when language and conventional communication methods, or even civilization as a whole, might be completely unrecognizable or even just destroyed. After an apocalypse, if there were any hope of human society rebuilding, the last thing they would need to deal with would be nuclear waste that they didn't understand. As even if we're gone, and our knowledge too, the radioactive material would certainly still exist. This field was born in 1981 after the US Department of Energy and a company called Bechtel Corporation got together to address this problem, forming a group called the Human Interference Task Force. 3 years later, they generated a report titled Reducing the Likelihood of Future Human Activities That Could Affect Geologic High-Level Waste Repositories. Though it's a lengthy 129 pages, this one report formed what remains the core idea behind nuclear semiotics, giving the field characteristics that would remain with it to this day. Namely, the fact that numerous disciplines are involved: climatologists, archaeologists, linguists, material scientists, psychologists, and more. I'll reference this report a lot in the video because it's one of the only sources of illustrations and, well, just general ideas related to this concept. But essentially, most of the main points of nuclear semiotics could be summed up in this report. Further, the name itself comes from nuclear, obviously, and semiotics, which refers to the study of symbols. Sandia Report. The second most important report to come out of this field would be the Sandia Report, published in 1993 by Sandia National Laboratories. This is where the field went from interesting to awesome and terrifying at the same time. This report, officially titled Expert Judgment on Markers to Deter Inadvertent Human Intrusion into the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, is over 300 pages long, but amended the field in 2 main ways. The first was that it suggested that the information conveyed by the messages in nuclear semiotics should increase from simple to very complex as one navigated closer and closer to the site, so that it would be, intellectually speaking, harder and harder to get in, and that advanced societies would eventually get the message. but simple ones would only see the outside of the facilities, knowing that it was just dangerous. The second thing it did was shape the design principles of nuclear facilities and nuclear semiotics, suggesting the abnormal and terrifying architecture that has come to define the field. The idea that these places should be built to appear man-made, but unnatural and unsettling, to convey fear and danger to future humans. We'll introduce that idea in the next entry. Spike fields. In the Sandia report, it was emphasized that to keep humans out of the sites, the land itself should appear shunned, evoking thoughts of pain and poisoning, making visitors uncomfortable enough to fear entering. The simplest, most well-known, and possibly most terrifying design proposed was the spike field. The spike field was a concept suggesting giant spikes protruding from the ground at different angles, looking sharp, dangerous, and most importantly, unnatural. The concept art provided is extremely unnerving, and it makes sense. They literally brought in communicative and psychological specialists to discuss what type of landscapes would appear foreboding to humans, going as far as the neurological level. It's a fascinating idea that has since snuck its way into some other media, which we'll discuss soon. This is not a place of honor. This quote refers to the general sentiment that needs to be communicated to future generations, which was summed up in the Sandia report as this full speech. This place is a message, and a system of messages. Pay attention to it. Sending this message was important to us. We considered ourselves to be a powerful culture. This place is not a place of honor. No highly esteemed deed is commemorated here. Nothing valued is here. What is here was dangerous and repulsive to us. This message is a warning about danger. The danger is in a particular location. It increases towards a center. The center of danger is here, of a particular size and shape, and below us. The danger is still present in your time as it was in ours. The danger is to the body, and it can kill. The form of the danger is an emanation of energy. The danger is unleashed only if you substantially disturb this place physically. This place is best shunned and left uninhabited. At the most basic level, this is what the field of nuclear semiotics is about. Communicating these ideas without present-day languages to humans which might not resemble us today, without any reference to present-day ideas or culture. What's fascinating to me is what the specialists chose to leave behind. For example, honor. That anthropologists concluded that even if human society was entirely destroyed, we would still revere things like burials or battlegrounds, valuing the concept of honor to a place or an esteemed death. It's a well-known speech now, and this might have actually been your introduction to nuclear semiotics, as it was for me, because it's been spread around online quite a bit. Raycats. Some unique solutions beyond just architecture have been proposed to communicate the danger of nuclear radiation. My personal favorite, which is also one of the most well-known, is the Raycat. The brainchild of a French author and Italian semioticistician, the Raycat is an idea so ridiculous but slightly fascinating. Given the fact that cats and humans have a rich history of cohabitation, the idea was, even after societal collapse, that this would probably still be the case. So, cats would be bred or otherwise genetically engineered to glow a bright color when exposed to radiation. Now, how exactly would a glowing cat advance the field of nuclear semiotics? Well, the idea would start today. The idea of a glowing cat would have to become ingrained in culture, art, songs, folklore, and much more. The idea is that the fear of a glowing cat would carry on over the centuries, and that communities of humans would eventually avoid radiation sites because they would develop this ingrained fear of the glowing cat. Now, this of course comes with two main problems. The first is that it supposes the fear of the glowing cat would survive, even if other things wouldn't. This here is one of the biggest issues with nuclear semiotics, picking and choosing what ideas would miraculously survive a societal collapse, and future human civilizations unrecognizable to ours. If we don't have similar written language anymore, what's to say that the paintings or songs of Raycats would have survived? The second issue with the Raycats is how we would even make them. maybe, just maybe, you could CRISPR one of these things into reality, but probably not. As much as I make fun of this idea, it is pretty interesting, and it's not really about cats. It's really about the idea of using something as a vessel for artificially generating a human fear or aversion that would eventually spread to every human being, which is super fascinating. I mean, to our knowledge, that's where the fear of the uncanny valley comes from, along with a whole host of other fears and aversions that a lot of humans have. This, of course, took a lot more than 10,000 years to develop, though. On the whole, it seems pretty impractical when you consider the scale of time required. Memes. There are a ton of memes about this phenomenon, and nuclear priests and spike fields specifically. Now I find this super ironic because the whole field of nuclear semiotics is about making memes. Ideas that spread without language, but get communicated at lightning speed. It's not a perfect comparison, but it's just a funny thing that popped into my head. Memes and semiotics are intertwined, and so perhaps it is to be expected that they go hand in hand like this. I actually spent an hour and lost a ton of my sanity searching on Instagram for a meme in this format, which I swear exists with like a guy going into a spike field, but I just couldn't find it. Anyways, memes are exposing a lot of people to this niche interest, which I just think is super interesting, especially given the subject matter. Human Interference Task Force. As mentioned before, the Human Interference Task Force was the group that really kicked off this whole thought experiment and scientific discipline. Much like Sandia Laboratories, the bulk of the contribution from the Human Interference Task Force comes from a single report titled Communication Measures to Bridge 10 Millennia. It's a super interesting review of iconography, symbolism, and communication throughout the years, and it laid out the problems with and pathways towards solving communication over 10,000 years. Though it doesn't have all the creepy stuff that Sandia Labs came up with. Nuclear priests. The nuclear priesthood was a nuclear semiotics proposal by linguist Thomas Semiotics, and it's one of those things that kind of just makes me think that this scientific discipline is more akin to writing Star Trek episodes than actually studying anything. But anyway, inspired by the Catholic Church, which has managed to preserve its message and organization for 2,000 years, a priesthood would be created to guard the truth behind nuclear waste. Hypothetically, by creating an organization shrouded in mystery and legend with dedicated membership, it might have a better chance of surviving through a complete societal collapse, still functioning and protecting humanity. The priesthood would indicate which areas are off-limits and punish disobedience. However, they would need power, which is why the priesthood would need to be global, and their members embedded into positions of power in the present day. However, there's an inherent problem with the priesthood, which is that it privileges the truth to the small class of priests, and in turn ignites human curiosity. There might be an attempt to discover the information by force, or otherwise fight back against the priesthood, as people might rightfully think that the priests are hiding valuable resources, or something along those lines. This isn't actually my least favorite proposal, and there is some ingenuity in thinking that ritual, legend, and secrecy actually cause an organization's survival. At the very least, it keeps people interested, and perhaps it could help an organization, and more importantly, their message, survive an apocalypse. Information levels. How exactly do we juggle communicating complex information about radiation, chemistry, and world politics while also designing something so simple that anyone could decode it? To that end, we have information levels, described at the very beginning of the Sandia report as one of the 7 major basic principles of effective nuclear semiotics. Number 5, multiple levels of complexity within individual messages on individual marker system element. The idea here is that information should get more and more complicated as you pass further and further into the site. Because if the site is designed effectively, a civilization should only be able to enter deeper depending on how advanced they are. Further, why waste your time explaining a periodic table to cavemen when you could instead put it inside and keep it protected for a civilization advanced enough to figure it out? It's one of the more basic characteristics of this discipline that will come up once or twice more in the Iceberg. Zeitschrift für Semiotik Poll.
Though many deterrence proposals we'll talk about today came from the Sandia report, some actually came from the German Journal of Semiotics, which I'm not going to try and pronounce again. I'm sure there were plenty of responses to the poll that we'll never know about, but the main ones included the Raycat proposal, the atomic priesthood proposal, and 3 others that will actually show up on the iceberg soon. But this poll here sort of explains why the discipline of nuclear semiotics is so, well, interdisciplinary, because people from across the world with many different scientific backgrounds contributed one way or another. And this is how, again, we have linguists and philosophers and all sorts of different types of people coming up with answers. Don't change color, kitty. Remember those Raycats from earlier? Well, in tandem with the actual Raycat was the idea that glowing cats needed to be ingrained into the collective unconscious. To do this, one idea that actually came to fruition was a song so annoyingly catchy that it would eventually protect humanity from radiation poisoning. The song is actually titled 10,000-Year Earthworm to Discourage Settlement Near Nuclear Waste Repositories, or Don't Change Color, Kitty. And no, sadly, I can't play the whole thing for you guys because you all know how music on YouTube works, but you should give it a listen.
Don't change color, kitty, keep your color, kitty, stay that pretty gray. Don't change color, kitty, keep your color, kitty, keep sickness away. Don't change color, kitty.
Can't even make fun of it because it's actually, like I said, annoyingly catchy. It's not a bad song. Sadly for humanity though, I don't think it ever got the recognition it deserved, so I'm not sure it'll effectively make me terrified of glowing cats, but oh well. I'll add it to my World War III playlist. Federal Disposal Field HZ-21. This entry refers to a site in Fallout 76, which was undoubtedly inspired by the spike fields in nuclear semiotic architecture. I don't think the game really gives the idea justice, but I understand that they were trying to make a game location and not necessarily just something terrifying. Now, I've never played Fallout 76, but from what I've looked into, it's a public shop type location where you can pick up quests. There's an even deeper connection, as the location was part of an in-game initiative called the 10,000 Years Initiative, which is literally just nuclear semiotics. Obviously, it didn't work too well, because in the game, you just waltz around this area like you please, but whatever. Avoiding resources. One of the more interesting developments in nuclear semiotics is the idea that nuclear waste repositories should be in places devoid of natural resources. It seems like a basic idea at first, that, you should hide things away from valuable stuff, but to me it almost makes the concept even scarier. That these facilities would be so far out in the barren desert, so far from anything that could have been civilization, that from the perspective of far future humans, we might again have this problem of curiosity. Why are terrifying monoliths buried out in an ancient desert? It's intriguing, and it might actually do more harm than good. Holes and voids. The second most well-known element of architectural design in nuclear semiotics are holes and voids. I'll quote a paragraph from the Sandia report to best explain the idea behind this one. Some of the archetypal feelings and meanings we will explore in design of the markers for the WIPP site are those of danger to the body, darkness, fear of the beast, pattern-breaking chaos and loss of control, dark forces emanating from within, the void or abyss, rejection of inhabitation, parched, poisoned, and plagued land, and others. This partially ended up in the black hole design, which included black dyed concrete or granite, which would become incredibly hot from solar absorption. It would give an appearance of a black hole, giving rise to nothing, looking ominous and uninhabitable, with a crazy quilt pattern of expansion joints, looking like cracked earth. This idea is pretty interesting for a few reasons. First of all, the incredibly hot characteristic shows that not only would it be psychologically aversive, but might actually have a natural feature making it pain to cross, giving people tons of time to back off of it, and creating a perpetual warning system. Once again though, we see the theme of shunned Earth, something that's mentioned a lot in nuclear semiotics. Land that can't be farmed on, preventing the most basic form of human settlement, and denying the use of land to future generations. It's an interesting proposal, and I think the only reason it doesn't look as scary as the spike fields is because it hasn't been illustrated nearly as many times. But conceptually, I think that a vast black square stretching across the land as far as you can see is really terrifying. Message kiosks. One feature that could be present in multiple designs hailing from the Sandia report are the message kiosks. Message kiosks would convey level 2 through 4 information, being present inside the facility for those who had dared to trespass the initial petrified landscape. Man, this sounds so cool. These guys are setting up the plot to a future Tomb Raider game or something. If the objective is to keep people out, they need to make it less awesome. Once inside, message kiosks made of cheap material so as not to be recycled or indicate any sense of use or purpose would leave messages of danger in many languages, with empty space left for future generations to write in their languages, so that hypothetically we would leave behind the most recent languages possible. The kiosks would be tall and imposing, so that the messages wouldn't be covered in sand or defaced easily. They would increase in complexity, moving as you went further, with level 4 kiosks having periodic tables, astronomic calendars, and world maps. There's a really good example midway through the Sandia report. Obviously, level 1 messages would just be the architecture or otherwise foreboding symbolism keeping you out. But I'll repeat the same message in text at a few different levels. Level 2 reads, Danger. Poisonous radioactive waste buried here. Do not dig or drill here before AD 12,000. Pretty simple, right? Okay, here's level 3. These standing stones mark an area used to bury radioactive wastes. This area is X by X kilometers, or X miles, or about X times the height of the average full-grown male person. And the buried waste is X kilometers down. This place was chosen to put this dangerous material far away from people. The rock and water in this area may not look, feel, or smell unusual, but may be poisoned by radioactive wastes. When radioactive matter decays, it gives off invisible energy that can destroy or damage people, animals, and plants. Do not drill here. Do not dig here. Do not do anything that will change the rocks or water in the area. Do not destroy this marker. The marking system has been designed to last 10,000 years. If the marker is difficult to read, add new markers and longer-lasting materials in languages that you speak. For more information, go to the building further inside. The site was known as the WIPP, Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, site when it was closed. Now, finally, I'll read a little bit of information from Level 4, which is even more complex. This place is a burial place for radioactive wastes. We believe this place is not dangerous if it is left alone. We are going to tell you what lies underground, why you should not disturb this place, and what may happen if you do. By giving you this information, we want you to protect yourselves and future generations from the dangers of this waste. The waste is buried X kilometers down in a salt layer. Salt was chosen because there's very little water in it, and cracks caused by digging the rooms for the waste reseal. There is a pocket of pressurized salt water X kilometers below the waste. There's a rock layer X kilometers below the surface that did not have drinkable water when we built the site. We studied all the things that could go wrong with the site. We found out that the worst things happen when people disturb the site. For example, drilling or digging through the site could connect the salt water below the radioactive waste with the water above the waste or with the surface. The salt water could wash through the waste and bring the poisonous and radioactive waste to the water near the surface or to the surface itself. People who drink the water will drink the poison. If the water is used for animals or crops, those too will be poisoned, and the people who eat them will be poisoned. It may take years for the sickness and death to show. Radioactivity poisons people because it can cause cancer. When radioactive matter decays, the energy it releases can damage the basic material of life in each cell in the human body. The damage can cause uncontrolled cell growth, called cancer, that can kill. You'll see at level 4 that the message kiosks would incorporate information from a variety of cultures that may have survived, also using units of measurements and more complicated concepts. Now, obviously this message in particular isn't set in stone, pun intended, but it would look something like that. Forbidding blocks. To wrap up this tier, we'll take a look at another terrifying architectural element, the forbidding blocks. The idea here is the presentation of huge cubic stones, placed in an undeniably human manner but without perfect order. They're claustrophobic. You can pass through them, but you can't live or farm there. The outsides are surrounded by spikes. Once again, the color black is used, this time as an outside dye to turn this hellish maze into an oven. It's made to make you so uncomfortable that you shun the area, with, once again, the theme of denying agriculture popping up. A Canticle for Leibowitz. A Canticle for Leibowitz is a 1959 novel which most likely inspired the nuclear priesthood proposal suggested by Thomas Semiotics. It's a story in 3 parts, each hundreds of years apart, about a Catholic monastery that survives a nuclear fallout, preserving human knowledge until the world is once again ready for it. It won a Hugo Award, just like the writings of Harlan Ellison and David Langford, whose stories I made into videos previously, if you're curious. It's an insanely popular story that, albeit not about nuclear semiotics, dabbles with the idea of a priesthood that obscures knowledge behind the veil of ritual, hiding it from humanity until they're ready to accept it. Lem proposals. Polish science fiction author Stanislaw Lem proposed 2 unique but ultimately somewhat stupid solutions to the nuclear semiotics problem. The first was the use of satellites to be sent in orbit to constantly transmit the message. Now this solves the problem of the Earth itself being dangerous to physical messages, sure, but it doesn't address the linguistic or cultural barriers involved in how we'd communicate the information. The solution skirts around half of the issues with nuclear semiotics. Further, the satellite would have to power itself and remain undamaged for 10,000 years, which sounds difficult at best. Then we'd assume that people would be able to even interpret the data transmitted through radio, which could totally happen if people were using old technology, but again, it would only work as long as people still spoke present-day languages and had access to radios. His second idea was what I'd call nuclear flowers. Flowers which would actually have this message inscribed into their DNA, mathematically. How would that be done? Well, I don't know, and neither did Lem. He suggested planting these information flowers around the nuclear sites and somehow encoding that message into their DNA. Admittedly, he did admit that in all likelihood, if a civilization could identify and decode information out of strands of DNA, they would probably know what radiation is. Both of these ideas are awesome ways to communicate information, but neither really belongs in nuclear semiotics. Let's say you wrote a message in DNA. Would it correspond to Morse code? English? Anything like that would be gone well before 10,000 years had passed after a civilizational collapse. It's a cool solution, but it doesn't pair well with this problem. Constellations. Something cool that was brought up a few times in the Sandia report was the use of astronomical diagrams to communicate when the nuclear material would be safe, or when someone could actually dismantle the site and live there. It's an interesting point to bring up because it identifies the fact that even the most ancient of human civilizations used astronomical calendars. It's one of those things that, if society was totally destroyed, we would probably come up with again. These diagrams would be placed in a secure room with other level 4 messages. Human curiosity. To end this level, we'll examine a bit of a philosophical entry. Depending on how you look at it, human curiosity is one of the most dangerous things in the entire world. And some researchers in the field of nuclear semiotics believe that the best way to hide nuclear material might just be to ignore it. Bury it somewhere and don't mark it at all. Why would someone dig a giant hole in a barren desert if they didn't need to? They probably just wouldn't. But I can say with utmost certainty that creating a structure, no matter how terrifying, would eventually intrigue after many years of observation. The structures scare, sure, but they don't kill. People would eventually realize that they aren't dangerous, just uncomfortable. I can imagine kids daring each other to stay in the spike fields for the longest. And just imagine how attractive something like this would be. Language, information, and culture may all die, but the human need to know certainly wouldn't. I can't say for sure I totally agree with the ignoring thing, but I do think a giant conspicuous structure isn't the greatest idea in the entire world. Kowalski proposal. Swiss physicist Emil Kowalski proposed a decently practical solution, that the storage facilities should be designed in a way that they can only be entered by an advanced society. How convenient, right? His idea was to focus less on communicating the message and more on ensuring that unwarranted breaches were next to impossible. And his ideas line up with the information levels from the Sandia report, where the complexity of information increases as you go deeper and deeper into the facility. But that information would only be made available or designed to be made available to societies strong enough to find it. For example, you might have a hypothetical steel door that only a civilization with powered or otherwise advanced cutting tools would get into, and that's where your level 3 or 4 information would be. Sadly, this is an idea that's more boring and more practical, not so creepy and fun like the others. Even if cave people find a nuclear storage site, if they're hit with 5-foot deep steel walls, they're cooked. The Kowalski proposal suggests that prevention, and maybe not communication, should be the focus of nuclear semiotics. Other design proposals. I highlighted a couple of design proposals that I thought were the most, visually dreadful, but I wanted to highlight the rest of them that came out with the Sandia report. First, there's the landscape of thorns, which are obviously very similar to the spike fields, just thinner and perhaps more interwoven. Next, there are spikes bursting through grid, once again maintaining the spear-like shape of a spike protruding from the ground, but this time placed over a grid, feeling even more unnatural. Then there are the leaning stone spikes, yet another variation of this concept. If you're sick of spikes, you're in luck, because this next one steps away from that design. The menacing earthwork idea suggests 4 vantage points, each at a corner of this square structure, which would contain a world map showing other nuclear waste disposal sites. This is followed by the rubble landscape, an inhospitable square of exploded stones. This next one is possibly my favorite lesser-known design, a giant world map one could walk across, where continents would be rigidly placed, and waste disposal sites would be indicated with, you guessed it, a spike coming out of the ground. Voigt proposal. Vilmos Voigt, a Hungarian professor, proposed an interesting idea, linguistically, which is actually sort of a reflection of how we translate old languages that no one speaks anymore. He suggested a circular pattern of warning signs in the most common human languages, but that rows of signs would be added as languages changed. The old signs, however, would not be moved. The idea is that the initial messages would be written in, say, English, sure, but as every minute change to the English language is observed, a new sign would be implemented. This would all be done in an effort to make whatever language was being used 10,000 years from now to be slightly more similar to the most updated signs, as opposed to the more distant and archaic English. This is a pretty smart solution if we say that, hypothetically, we store nuclear material today, but there isn't a societal collapse until 2,000 years from now, and we have to protect humanity for those next 8,000 years. Take a look at how Beowulf was written, and how this is technically Old English, and you'll understand how important this would be. Languages change over time, and regardless of what other proposal you combine Voigt's idea with, it would be imperative to help out future civilizations by letting them walk backwards through the linguistic changes over time to decode the initial message. Tutankhamun's tomb. Interestingly, the idea of King Tut's tomb being cursed is actually a myth. And cursing a tomb wasn't super common in Egypt. But uncommon doesn't mean never. There are some examples of curses being directed towards those who would desecrate burial sites. And even if rooted in a sort of misconception, using this ancient Egypt's example still works. What if people interpret nuclear warnings as curses, just like this? Imagine a society that developed and was able to interpret old languages, which does make sense, right? I mean, I'd imagine a post-Fallout or whatever society would spend more time uncovering old knowledge than making new. So what if they've discovered ancient language, but not yet nuclear radiation, and they think that the warnings are simply a curse from a deity they no longer believe in? It's an unlikely case, but it is a point that should be considered. How do we communicate genuinity in these messages? This is a key issue of nuclear semiotics. Today's unreadable monuments. How many ancient monuments, cities, statues, or sites exist today that we don't understand? To the ancient people who constructed these things, they made total sense. They were connected to their religions, their legends, their land. But now that the people have disappeared, no one can explain them. What if the Nazca lines are warnings about a giant race of ants that are buried in Peru? Sounds crazy, but this is a pretty good example of a message of some kind which has lasted over 1,000 years. What can nuclear semiotics do differently to ensure communication lasts the test of time? We brought in experts of all disciplines, but even so, there's no 100% solution to all of the problems involved. Contemporary signs. Today, there are plenty of frightening signs around the world, warning of various dangers. And as you might expect, some go entirely unheeded. One of my favorites is this sign warning about the dangers of cave diving. Or this warning about somewhere where you should absolutely not ski. I'm actually tempted to make an iceberg just about these if you guys are interested. It's really cool to look at how contemporary warnings spell out danger in a very clear and sequential way. A to B, B to C, etc. Kind of like nuclear semiotics strives to do. Of course, these signs have the convenience of not needing to worry about thousands of years of linguistic change, but it's still interesting to see the similarities, and how some people still ignore them. It's also interesting to see how we represent death, skull and crossbones, or the Reaper. In our culture, that makes sense, but it won't necessarily in the future. The Sandia report actually has an interesting excerpt on this. Graphics are likely to be culturally restricted in meaning. There are no conventional signs, such as the skull and crossbones, for example, that convey the same meaning across cultures. A bar across a picture of someone digging may suggest prohibition of digging to people now, but no one can be sure it will not be seen as suggesting something positive about digging 3,000 years from now. Representation of human faces and human and animal figures tend to be recognized for what they are, however, across cultural boundaries and millennia. For example, we have no trouble recognizing such figures in the Paleolithic cave paintings of Europe and in prehistoric rock carvings and rock shelter paintings in Africa, Australia, and the Americas. We can even recognize many of the activities in which the human figures in these paintings seem to be engaged. But why these representations were put there, and what the beholders should infer from them, are obscure, and the subject of conflicting interpretations. Cross-cultural ambiguity of this kind is especially likely with the use of cartoons. Later on, the report suggests that, as an example, the skull and crossbones wouldn't be effective in Mexico, as there they have a more positive meaning. Concept is impractical. In this entry, I cordially welcome you back to Seedbutter's not-so-deep thoughts. Sort of in a little different direction than the human curiosity stuff, but a little bit different. Nuclear semiotics, to some degree, studies a problem which is very unlikely to occur. A complete societal collapse to some might seem possible, but even if that did happen, it's very unlikely that people would somehow develop in a way that makes them both advanced enough to want to excavate ancient stuff in the middle of nowhere, but also not advanced enough to be able to perceive radiation. Obviously, there was archaeology before we knew about radiation, but the problem seems A, not super likely to happen, and B, very expensive to actually prepare for. Studying nuclear semiotics to some degree is a great idea, and we should do what we can to protect anyone, societal collapse or not, from being exposed to radioactive material. However, the solutions proposed, like sending satellites into orbit, genetically engineering plants, creating a cult embedded into worldwide government, and it seems like it would be impossible to convince any leader or investor to actually execute it. It's not that it isn't fascinating, it's just sometimes this is more of a thought experiment than an actionable discipline. Mournful whistling. Something I don't hear talked about that much in the realm of nuclear semiotics, that is, in my opinion, maybe the spookiest architectural design of all, is the idea of a structure that produces mournful whistling. Much like the Spongehenge episode of SpongeBob, the concept here is to create a structure that would emanate a psychologically disturbing tone automatically as wind passes through. This idea is touched on briefly in the Sandia report, and the writers themselves even say that they didn't have enough time to really flesh out the idea, suggesting communication of basic level 1 message could also take place through sound. Though probably not lasting for the full 10,000 years, structures designed to resonate in the wind could be placed around the site. The effect of various sounds generated should be consonant with the overall site design, namely a place of great foreboding. Indeed, sounds that can be readily generated by long-lasting alien structures often turn out to be dissonant and mournful, and so would readily serve our purposes. Noise levels would need to be controlled so as not to disturb people residing in the general vicinity of the site. This isn't the first time that sound has been weaponized to create fear. This idea reminded me of Operation Wandering Soul, where during Vietnam, American forces blasted sounds of ghosts to pressure NVA forces to surrender. Though it's not for warfare, the idea of seeing a megastructure that stretches as far as you can see, humming loudly, almost as if it's a living, breathing, and foreboding organism, is unsettling in a way I can't really describe. It's a good mix of megalophobia and a strange primal fear. I think it's an interesting proposal, but that it would only work against the most basic of human societies. Leaving behind an AI. A proposal that instantly came to my mind to solve the linguistic side of things would be leaving behind an artificial intelligence wherever level 4 markers are located. It seems silly, but we already have trained AI models to start learning the rules of a language. Basically, we train them, then give them a language they've never seen, and they can put it together. We could leave one of these models, trained in as many known languages as possible, in the site to learn whatever language the people are speaking within a few months of study, in all likelihood. This wouldn't work in a vacuum by any means. You would still need to indicate how much danger is there, but hypothetically, if a society understood level 2 or 3 messages, but couldn't figure out level 4 messages due to a linguistic barrier, we could leave an AI that would outlast society, and could then guide the future humans through the situation. Inhuman visitors. We've focused thus far on anthropology, psychology, and linguistics, assuming that, in 10,000 years, the things entering a nuclear waste facility would be human. But maybe that's not the assumption we should be making. Neither report really touches on it, but one thing I think it would be kind of fun to theorize about in nuclear semiotics is how we'd handle inhuman visitors coming to our sites of nuclear disposal. It's also a really good way of reframing the problem. If we could convey the message to aliens, we could certainly convey it to any human, as intrinsically, the messages aren't supposed to contain cultural or religious references, but can include any details that humans might have ingrained mentally cross-culturally. So intending to create a message for an alien would actually push us to make the message even more communicable and might provide a more surefire solution to the problem. Now, I imagine if an alien is capable of spaceflight, they probably know about radiation too. But what if they just aren't checking? What if the level 1 architecture actually resembles something honorable or interesting in their culture? Or the things that psychologically upset or disturb humans don't have the same effect on them? There aren't many ways to really push this idea further, but I think it's fun to speculate. Nuclear semiotics are a distraction. What if this report really isn't about nuclear waste? We've already mentioned how a lot of people think drawing any attention whatsoever to nuclear waste is a bad idea, so what if this is overkill? What if the Sandia report was commissioned to suggest ideas for hiding something entirely different? And if so, what on earth might that be? There's a lot of lore around spoopy stuff happening in the Southwest United States. And without getting into it, I can promise that it has nothing to do with nuclear waste. What if the study of symbolism and human psychology was a cover-up for something else? Maybe something related to extraterrestrials? Or even a distraction for something entirely different? Maybe the project's goal was to get people used to the idea of a weird or terrifying construction or work going on in that corner of the world, and the report was generated to be used as evidence in the future to suggest to the people that whatever was happening was all according to plan, and not weird or suspicious by any means. Something to think about. The atomic priesthood is real. An essential characteristic of the nuclear priesthood is that, to have any influence at all, they would need to be embedded into positions of power. Since the atomic priesthood wasn't really researched in depth, to the degree of, say, the Sandia report, it wasn't fully fleshed out. And it remains to be seen whether the atomic priesthood would be openly atomic priests, or if they'd be flying under the radar, assuming other roles and names. hiding their true intentions and developing political careers, getting into important industries, and finding their place in the upper echelon. Maybe that's happening now. Maybe somebody or some organization or state really is taking nuclear semiotics seriously, and even likes the nuclear priesthood proposal, providing instructions to their elite to serve as a nuclear priesthood if the time ever comes. The chance is slim, but with these guys, you never know. Priesthood ritual. One of the aspects of the atomic priesthood is hiding or otherwise obscuring the real nature of nuclear materials. However, the specifics of these rituals haven't been disclosed. When you're creating a religion or cult or whatever you want to call it artificially for a specific purpose and not just a local power grab, how do you take factual information and slip it into layers of doctrine, rites, and theology without disorganizing it or ruining the quality of the information? That's an excellent question. What would priesthood rituals look like? Would you ingest or handle the material? Would it be worshipped in some way or revered for its power? To ensure that the priesthood always remembers that it's dangerous, would they sacrifice people by giving them cancer? I don't really know. It's more of a thought exercise, and I'm curious to hear in the comments below what you think it would look like if it were actually executed. The warnings already exist. I'll end this iceberg with what is possibly the most terrifying thing I could fit here. Adding to the fact that there's plenty of monuments we don't understand today, there could be warning constructions around the world, known to us or unknown, that we may have ignored, or worse yet, we're soon to open up. I had this thought while I was working through this video, and maybe a commenter could let me know because genuinely I don't know, but how often do we just walk around with Geiger counters in our hands? Surely it's possible that we could excavate something interesting and find nuclear material and get sick before we realized what it was. I'm not saying it would happen a lot, but it's hypothetically possible. Sure, we can detect radiation, but how often are we voluntarily doing that? Does any possibility exist that any extraterrestrial visitors to the planet, or any ancient advanced civilizations long lost to us, may be left behind any of these materials that we ourselves are burying? This is a fun thought and is highly, highly unlikely, but I do think it's interesting to think about the abundance of structures we don't understand, which may have been just as psychologically provoking to other people in ancient times, that should make us fearful today, but don't. What else is hidden on Earth? What dangers await their uncovering? And most importantly, what messages will we ignore? Okay guys, that last one was sorta just for fun, but anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this video. After stumbling along this topic, I thought I couldn't ignore it. And since it's not really a linear conversation, it's more just like a bunch of ideas fitting this schema, some of which are creepy, it felt perfect for an iceberg. I do want to throw out there that if you're interested in the subject, you really should read the Sandia report. It's super long, but if you treat it like a book instead of an academic paper, it feels pretty natural and it's an entertaining read. Further, it actually provides really interesting insights into the disciplines involved in nuclear semiotics, giving really interesting introductions to things like semiotics and linguistics, beyond which I've actually seen in actual textbooks and formal learning. So I do recommend reading it in full if you want to learn more. It'll be linked in the video description. I hope you enjoyed this iceberg. I apologize for some delays with work. Graduate school is a big commitment at the moment, but there is a lot laid out for us to look at in the near future. So for your new visitor, please subscribe so we can hit that 100,000 mark before the end of next year. Also again, November 11th was the channel's 3rd birthday, and November 12th was when I uploaded our first video, so I just wanted to thank so many of you for being a big part of this. Whether you've been a fan since all the way back in 2021, and comment if you are, comment your first video you saw actually, that's what I want to hear. Or if you're here for the first time, thanks for stopping by and supporting me in a way that keeps these videos coming. With that said, I hope I've earned your sub, and I hope I see you soon. Have a good night, guys.